Well, thanks again for joining me. I'm really blessed to be able to see you all tonight and to be able to continue with this session 8 of our Holocaust studies. And tonight will be the final one for a short period of time. We'll resume on the 15th of July, when we will hopefully have Shirley Sager from Canada, who will present to us her family history. And I'm not sure whether we'll do that on YouTube or whether we'll do it on Zoom. But from the 15th of July, the studies, I think, will probably be by Zoom. So if you can let me know if you want to continue with the studies and if you want to join us on Zoom on the 15th of July. But I will send out details. So just let me know what you feel about things. And if we were on Zoom, it would make sure that you were able to ask questions, and it would be more of a discussion as well. So, and I could share some of the PowerPoint presentation. So, and certainly I'd like to ask Shirley some questions. So if we can get Shirley on Zoom on the 15th of July, then we can ask her about a family background. So tonight we continue really with our study of the eugenics in Holocaust and the importance of that, but how Mengele carried out his evil acts, and we're going to look at also the recording and the data collection of information regarding the Jewish communities in Europe prior to the Holocaust, because it's quite clear that the Nazi regime knew who the Jews were before they went into a city or a town, and they put notices on the community boards and said, 4 o'clock in the morning, please be here with just some of your belongings. How did they know about who they were? So we're going to look at that whole question and the data gathering system that took place before the war and actually during the war as well, and who was involved in that. And one of the books that I want to recommend to you, I did actually mention this book last week, is this book by Edwin Black, which is IBM and the Holocaust, because we're going to look at IBM's input into Holocaust. And IBM is an American company, as you know, and we're going to start the presentation looking at IBM, and we'll look at who they are and the importance of them. And it does take us into Holocaust. So don't think we're just talking about an American company. Tonight, I'll be using a lot of references about America because they influenced the eugenics movement in Nazi Germany before and during the war. So let's have a look at IBM. IBM was the International Business Machines Corporation. And it's an American multinational technology company headquartered in Armonk, New York, with operations in over 170 countries. The company began in 1911 and was founded in Endicott, New York, as the Computing, Tabulating, Recording Company, and was renamed International Business Machines in 1924, IBM. IBM is incorporated in New York today, and it influences a lot of our technology today. Now, Herman Hollerith created a tabulator which consisted of electrically operated components that captured and processed sensor data by reading holes on a paper punch card. Now, he worked for IBM. He was one of the clever guys who worked for IBM, and he created this data capturing machine, and it was called the Hollerith Machine after Herman Hollerith himself. Now, if you want to Google this, you'll get a lot of pictures of these machines. They're really quite big, and they had holes they punched holes depending on what data you needed to gather, and they had punch cards which were created with the data on them, and those punch cards could be read on a Hollerith machine which created them later on, and they could be stored. So it was really one of the first kind of computer data collection machines. IBM entered the European market in early 1930s with this machine. IBM, who had used the Hollerith machine in the USA for census, sought to help the Nazi Party when they came to power to record various types of personal information, not just in regard to health and disabilities, but also religion. Now, you might say, well, what are they doing collecting information about health and disabilities and religion? Well, the Nazi Party wanted to know who was ill, who was challenged, who was mentally ill, who was physically ill, but they also wanted to know who the Jews were, who even half Jews or quarter Jews. They wanted to gather the data because they were looking at creating a super Aryan race. And in order to do that, they wanted to eliminate any part of the community which, in their view, tainted the blood of the Aryan. So they wanted details of who these people were so that they could eventually eliminate them. And that was in the mind of the Nazis. And we're going to look at this when we look at Mengele. That was in the eyes of the Nazis, straight from 1933. Now, when Hollerith created this machine, he knew, or the Nazis asked them, IBM, to create the machine so they could record specific data, as I've said. And column 22 on the Hollerith machine was in regard to religion. So if you were Protestant, Catholic, or a Jew, it came under column 22 in the Hollerith machine. Protestant was code 1, Catholic was code 2, and code 3 was Jew. Fields and columns were used to identify the required information. And the required information was such things as mental disease. So field 12 in the Hollerith machine was coded 1, mental disease was coded 2, cripples were coded 3, deaf people were coded 5. And parents who had been sterilized were marked with an S and their children an AS. Now, when I say they had been sterilized, it was because since 1934 and early in 1935, laws had been passed in Nazi Germany to sterilize people who were thought unfit to procreate and bring future generations. And it was involuntary sterilization. Now, you might be shocked at that, but we learned last week, for those of you who listen, that actually in America, there was involuntary sterilization for who were considered the unfit. So IBM going over to Germany and working with the eugenics people in Germany actually wasn't a surprise to the people who knew what was going on. Occupations were coded as well. So factory workers were coded 19. Hotel workers were coded 23. Theatre workers 26. And the unemployed were coded 28. So people with diseases, influenza, for instance, were coded 3, lupus 7, syphilis 9, and if you had diabetes, it was 15. Now, where did they get this information from? Well, clearly you can see the labor office in Germany would provide information about who was working, etc. But also the medical profession, doctors' surgeries would provide information regarding ill health of people. And also within the religious sector, the information was provided by churches and pastors. Now, insurance companies were also instructed to provide details on the Hollerith machine. Actually, they weren't instructed, they were told they had to. They were told they had to inform the authorities of who had these particular diseases. Now, you know, if you apply for an insurance, they ask you if you have any ill health issues. And And for me, I think I said last week, I have something called hemochromatosis, which is something, a genetic disease, which is specific to Ashkenazi Jews, actually. And if what I do is I retain iron in my blood. So that would go on the information on the Hollerith machine, and maybe it was pointed out to somebody, well, he might have Jewish blood. So all this information was gathered together, collated from places like insurance companies, but also churches were requested to provide records of births and marriages and baptisms and conversions as well. So if a Jew converted to Christianity, then the record was kept, and the pastors were told to inform the authorities. And in fact, some pastors were given Hollerith machines to record such information. And this provided records for thousands of baptized Jews within Christendom. So when Nazi Germany went into an area and they spoke to the local people and said, we're going to gather you up, the local Jews, they knew who had already converted. So they went into the churches and they said, we want you, you, and you as well, because they had that information already recorded. It wasn't guesswork or just madly rounding people up. They knew exactly who their target was. And again, you can see these punch cards if you Google Hollerith machine, you'll see those. Now, central to the Nazi effort was a massive 500-man Hollerith group. And so there were 500 people designated to work these Hollerith machines that IBM was supplying to Nazi Germany. And these were these people and the machines were installed in a looming brown building in Krakow. So they had a specific building to record all this information. The Hollerith group of Nazi Statistical Office records and the members who supplied these records enabled information to go into one central place so that they had full information about those whom they were going to round up, bring into ghettos, and also put them on transport for the death camps. So they had that information. Now, the trains running to Auschwitz were tracked by special guards who were assisted by IBM suppliers. And the millions of these punch cards that were supplied continued to record details of everywhere Jews went. So if Jews were brought into Warsaw Ghetto, Nazi Germany knew who they were, they knew who was in the ghetto, and because of the statistics on this punch card, and they kept a close record of where these Jews went. So, as I said, it was a very systematic capture of the Jews and targeting of the Jews so that they didn't miss anybody out. They had all the records they needed. Now, these records were so extensive that no one could escape being identified. Some of the data actually in these machines went back to the 18th century, so that Nazi Germany knew who grandparents and great-grandparents were. So with regard to the Jewish community, they knew exactly where they lived, how long they'd lived in a particular place, and who their parents and great-grandparents were. And as I've said, it was in regard, first of all, to the forced sterilization of Jews, so the Jews couldn't procreate. And in 1934, we see that there were 62,400 Jews who were sterilized in that year. By 1935, there was 71,700 sterilized in that year. So it increased this, and these were forced sterilizations. And we're going to look, we'll mention that when we come to Mengele a bit later on. Now, informations on the cards were created by the machine at a rate of 24,000 an hour. Now, that's pretty impressive, isn't it? If we think of computers today, how much information we can input into that if we're doing an address book or whatever, that's it. We can do a lot. But for this particular machine, which was inputted by these 500 users, 24,000 details of 24,000 people per hour was quite impressive. And as I've said, it would be, you know, are you Jewish? Your grandparents Jewish? Have you a disability, etc., etc., etc. So when the Jews were identified, they were recorded on a separate Jewish counting card as well. So there would be two cards, but specifically for Jews, they created this one particular card. Now, late in 1933, by using this data, the Reich Statistical Office were able to say that the majority of Jews in Berlin were living in a particular district. And in this case, it was Wilmersdorf district in Berlin. So they knew exactly where Jews were living from these cards. They could say that in this particular district in Berlin, I'm giving this as an example, that 26,000 were observant Jews, 1,200 were involved in the fur industry, and 3/4 of them were foreign-born who had moved in to this district in Berlin. So they knew a huge amount of detail about the Jewish people. And that was in 1933. So you can imagine that the idea of annihilation, elimination of the Jews was went back a long time before the war started in 1939. Now, IBM devised a system within the Hollerith data collection, which not only gave the details of religion, but also religion at birth. And that was important. The intended target was the Jew by blood, not religion. And we spoke about that last week, didn't we? And included ancestry, which would include non-practicing Jews. So you would have non-practicing Jews who would say, well, we're not Jews at all. But the data that the Nazis had would say, well, you were born a Jew. We could say you are a Jew. Whether you're practicing or not, you have Jewish blood. And they also were able to say how many of these Jews had converted to other religions. Now, intelligence from the data was used at the Wannsee conference. Do you remember we looked at the Wannsee conference where the final solution was decided and figures were given to look at the elimination of Jews? Well, this intelligence on this data was used at that. And IBM consultants continued throughout the war to work with the Nazi Party to ensure standards of record keeping were maintained, because Hermann Hollerith designed this machine that was so robust in its data collection that he and IBM wanted to ensure that this machine was used properly and accurately to collect data, because it didn't want any criticism that the data was wrong. So IBM consultants worked with the Nazi Party throughout the war, even though the machine was being used to eliminate Jews, so that they could keep the standards of record keeping high, which is quite startling, isn't it? An example of the importance to the Reich is that of the Romanian Roundup. So I'm going to give you an example of the Romanian Roundup of Jews. Now, Romania entered the war on the 22nd of June, 1941. And it was known that in Romania, there were 375,422 Jews. And how did they know? Because this data had been collected from 1933 on the Hollerith machine. So they knew when Romania entered the war in 1941, 22nd of June, in this particular month that we're doing this teaching in, and they knew exactly how many Jews were in Romania. Now, the Romanian Prime Minister, Marshal Antonescu, demanded lists of all the Jews in Romania. So he demanded from the Nazi Party that he be given lists of the Jews, because he was in favor of annihilation of the Jews as well. Therefore, when the Romanian and the Nazi police entered the city of Lassi, and I'm giving this as an example, it was known not only who were Jewish, but also where they lived. This meant that thousands of Jews were dragged out of their beds at night and rounded up, ready for transportation in just a few days after the occupation took place in June. In these roundups, 13,000 Jews lost their lives just in the roundups by brutal and violent arrests. Now, by the 17th of November 1943, Antonescu, the Prime Minister of Romania, could say, according to the data, that 50,000 Jews were left alive, and therefore they needed to carry on with the roundups. So the idea of just Nazi Germany and a particular government working with the Nazis, just guessed who the Jews were, is false. They knew exactly who they were, where they lived, and what their family relationships were, and also if they were ill. In August 1943, a timber merchant from Benzin, Poland, arrived at Auschwitz. I'm moving on now from Romania, I'm sorry. I just want to move on as quickly as I can so we can get the teaching about Mengele in. But I think this is really important for us to understand. So I'll start here. In August 1943, this is another example of the importance of the Hollerith Machine. A timber merchant from Benzin, Poland, arrived at Auschwitz. He was among a group of 400 inmates, mostly Jews. First, a doctor examined him briefly to determine his fitness for work. So that's what happened when he first gets in there. His physical information was noted on a medical record. So everything about his physical information was recorded. Second, his full prisoner registration was completed with all personal details. And third, his name was checked against the indexes of the political section to see if he would be subject to special punishment. Finally, he was registered in the Labour Assignment Office and assigned a characteristic 5-digit number, which was tattooed on his arm. And that number was the number which was already in the data system collected by the Hollerith Machine, because the Hollerith Machine gave a specific number to each person. And the number in this case for this prisoner was 44673. And this 5-digit Hollerith number was part of the original custom punch card system devised by IBM to track prisoners in Nazi concentration camps, including slave labor at Auschwitz, which is where this timber merchant was destined for. Later in the summer of 1943, all non-Germans at Auschwitz were similarly tattooed, because this timber merchant was tattooed with this number. And from that time on, everybody else who went into Auschwitz, everybody who was not German who went into Auschwitz, was tattooed. And that is what happened. That's where this tattoo number came from. Now, tattoos, however, quickly evolved at Auschwitz. Soon they bore no further relationship with the Hollerith Machine compatibility. For one reason, the Hollerith number was designed to track a working inmate, not a dead one. Once the daily death rate at Auschwitz climbed, Hollerith-based numbering simply became outmoded. So I don't know whether you understand that, but first of all, the Hollerith Machine dictated the number of the prisoner. But it was only applicable to people who were alive, because that's what the data was collected for. for information for the Nazi government or the Nazi party. But when en masse Jews were being killed at places like Auschwitz and other murder camps, these numbers were not applicable. So they started up another numbering system, continued with the tattoos, but it was another numbering system. But the original numbering system in Auschwitz was the number for that was given by the Hollerith machine, which collected data years before the person actually arrived in Auschwitz. Now, did they know that many of the ideas the Nazis had about them were formulated? Sorry, let me just explain this to you. Jews knew they were being rounded up. They knew, well, they were being rounded up. They were put into ghettos. Some were taken to the pits and killed, and they were treated badly. But did they know that actually this all started, as we looked last week, in a eugenics program that had its roots in America and the UK? Well, you've done the eugenics talk last week. It's very unlikely that the Jews who were arrested realized that actually they had been identified by Nazi Germany from 1933 onwards. Did they know that their identities of their families were known and even recorded? So when they were being rounded up to be murdered, did they know that their families also were targeted by Nazi Germany? It's very, very doubtful. Now, I want to move on to Mengele. And I bring him in here at this particular, in this particular session, because as you've seen, Nazi Germany and America worked very closely in regard to data collection and with regard to statistical records and data regarding not only Jews, but also people who were physically and mentally sick. So Mengele fits into this story, it fits into this session. But before I start talking directly about Mengele, I want to just give you some background, because we must put his life into context and the evil that he'd done into context with regard to data analysis and eugenics and America and other people that he was working for. Now, we cannot approach the evil of Mengele, who was known as the Angel of Death, without understanding the motive for his evil acts. And neither can we ignore the fact that his monstrous experiments involved a conspiracy with many others in the international eugenics program. He didn't stand alone. He can't stand alone and be charged as an individual with experiments and murders that he committed at the extermination camps, because others were involved. There are others with whom he collaborated in their efforts to create a super race. His experiments were considered essential to the so-called cleansing of blood of a race, which would ultimately control the world. So that's what was in his mind and in the mind of others. For Europe, it was a super Aryan race. Germany wanted a super Aryan race. But in America, they were at the same time, the eugenics program, which was supported by Roosevelt, as I've mentioned, and other big financiers, they wanted to create a super Nordic race, very, very similar. The USA had long held this vision and already had legal involuntary sterilization programs in place to achieve this. But what Nazi Germany did was to extend their vision into a genocide of the Jews, alongside a program of the most evil and inhumane experiments formulated to achieve this vision of a perfect super who would ultimately rule. So it was a well-planned system that Mengele would be part of. Now, on arrival at the death camps, there was only two things Jews could expect. One, to be murdered immediately, or two, their murder was to be deferred until the Nazis had extracted all they needed from them. Of course, labor was very important for the war effort and to build facilities in order to complete the plan of genocide against the world's Jewry. But there was also another reason why many were chosen to live temporarily, and this was that they were to be used as human guinea pigs in the most evil ways imaginable, as a way of understanding how Germany could create this super Aryan race. As we've seen already, eugenics was a critical factor in the lead-up to the final solution and was the driving force behind the Nuremberg laws. The question of separation of Jews from the rest of society was examined in the light of eugenics, and one of Germany's prominent medical researchers, Dr. Ottmar Freyer von Verschuer, he led this program. Verschuer was a rabid anti-Semite and taught his students that the struggle for Nazi Germany for a super Aryan race was primarily against Jews. In 1935, he founded the Institute for Hereditary, Biological and Racial Hygiene in Berlin. Now, again, I mentioned this book last week by Edwin Black. It's a really wonderful book, and I suggest if you can't buy it because it's quite expensive, you try and loan one, because it's full of information about this particular person, Verschuer, and the eugenics program in America, of course, because that's what the book is written for. It's a war against the weak by Edwin Black. Now, this institute that Verschuer created was a big institute. It had buildings. It included lecture halls, clinics, and libraries. SS and Nazi Party members of the public health and welfare departments were all taught at this particular institute. So it wasn't just one guy working by himself. It was a huge institution supported by Nazi Germany. And the public health and welfare department's workers were all taught in this institute. Soon, all of Germany's medical training was carried out by the institute, which focused on the idea that Jews and half-Jews had genetic defects which affected the whole of the German society, or affected the Aryan race. And that's what the medical profession, the welfare services, and public health officials were taught, that Jews had these genetic defects which affected the whole of society. Now, Verschuer was a follower of the American eugenics program, and in return, the American eugenicists republished many of Verschuer's papers. During 1936, many exchanges took place between German and American eugenicists over the question of sterilization, which was compulsory both in America and in Germany. Now, American eugenics scientists visited the Verschuer Institute at the end of 1938 and reported back favorably on Verschuer's work, despite the obvious anti-Semitic nature of the work, and also the fact that there was lots of Nazi flags flying all over the institute. So as late as 1939, American finances were also used to assist Germany's eugenics programs. Even as persecution of the Jews of Europe increased and was made known to the rest of the world during 1937 and 1938. Even though that was the case, American eugenics leaders who were Nazi sympathizers and openly anti-Semitic collaborated with Verschuer over Germany's sterilization program of the Jews. The American eugenics had long been interested in researching twins' eyes, blood, and hereditary diseases and deformities, and had completed papers on hereditary aspects of things like cleft lip, cleft palate, and Down syndrome, exactly as we see in abortion today. Now, claiming that the elimination of the hereditary process by sterilization was a step closer to the superior Nordic race. Like the American counterparts, Virchow was fascinated in the study of twins, as he had thought that the research of twins would help with the creation of a perfect Aryan race. So we see that the Americans were very keen on understanding hereditary issues such as Downs and cleft palate, and because they said that it affected the perfect Nordic race, then Virchow was exactly the same, in exactly the same stable, if you like, in his belief that they could find out and eradicate these children by sterilization, or stop the process of people having children who had these issues like cleft palate and Downs. Virchow believed that the best research would be accomplished through post-mortem examinations of twins. And at the end of May 1943, he obtained permission from Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, to carry out experiments in the death camps on both live and dead twins. For Virchow's studies, it was an ideal, the death camps were an ideal situation because he could keep the twins alive, but also carry out post-mortem examinations on them when they were dead. But Virchow didn't want to work in the camp himself, didn't want to work in Auschwitz or in any of the other extermination camps. Now, this takes us now to Mengele, because Virchow was connected strongly to Mengele. Josef Mengele was born on the 16th of March 1911 in Günzburg, Germany. After joining the anti-Semitic stormtroopers in 1934, he continued his academic life and was awarded a PhD in 1935, having studied under Theodor Mollison, an anti-Semitic eugenicist. So he was trained already by an anti-Semitic eugenicist. Mengele's dissertation was on the subject of racial groups, identities being identified by their jawline. And that's what Mengele's PhD was on. Mengele always sought to be involved in medical research, and in particular, he was fascinated with eugenics research rather than medical practice. In 1937, Mengele became Virchow's assistant researcher and often corroborated Virchow's evidence during court cases concerning Jewish lineage for the purpose of sterilization of those who were considered to be Jews or half Jews. So people were taken to, if they refused to be sterilized, they were taken to court and they were forced to be sterilized. And if they were Jews, and they said, well, we're half Jews, or my parents were not Jews, etc., they would maybe go to court and appeal. But Mengele and Virchow would give evidence that that particular person is a Jew. By the way they look, that's the evidence they gave. Their goal was to realize a pure Aryan race, a super race void of Jewish blood. That's what their goal was. And also a Aryan race which had which would eliminate any deformity or disease. In 1938, Mengele joined the SS and received a medical degree and researched the inheritance of ear fistulas, chin dimples, and other facial features. Like Virchow, he was fascinated with inherited deformities such as cleft lip, cleft palate, Down syndrome, and epilepsy. From 1940 onwards, Mengele performed racial and eugenics examinations on Poles, and served in 1941 the SS in the Ukraine, and actually served on the battlefield in the Ukraine as well. And he was given 2 Iron Crosses for bravery. Now, Verscher's goal of having a researcher in the death camps was achieved on the 30th of May, 1943, when, with Verscher's help, Mengele was given the post of Chief Medical Officer of Auschwitz. Under Verscher's direction and Himmler's permission, Mengele set up a modern, well-equipped examination room, pathology laboratories, and clinics which were outstanding and of the finest quality. They were superbly modern for the time, and they didn't relate to anything else that was happening in Auschwitz. They were central in Auschwitz, but they were superbly modern and perfectly built. And also, he selected one of the barracks, barrack number 14, he chose for housing twins which came into Auschwitz, because Verscher was fascinated by twin examinations, and also Mengele. So he chose a particular barrack, and that was barrack 14. Now, as the transports arrived, as you will know, Mengele would stand at the ramp selecting those to be gassed immediately and those selected for work. But there were also guards who called out twice every few minutes, Zwingli, Zwingli, and meaning twins, and taking twins, and they took the twins to barrack 14. They were chosen. Sometimes when the parents heard that the twins, that if they had twins, were going to be chosen to live, they would voluntarily tell Mengele or the guards, we have twins here. And the twins were taken directly to barrack 14. The twins were looked after and given special rations. And this was for no other reason than to have them in good health for testing, examinations, and ultimately, when the twins were killed, for autopsies. Now, Mengele had the twins' history fully documented when they arrived. They were photographed, and every part of the twins was measured for this eugenics program that he was partly involved in with Verscher and other eugenicists in Germany. And Mengele would perform blood tests. He gave the twins lumbar punctures. Sometimes he carried out internal surgery, sometimes without anesthesia. And they were subjected to numerous medical experiments, and sometimes just left to die in pain. Now, I had some time with a Holocaust survivor from Auschwitz who was one of Mengele's twins. And he had, and his twin brother, had gone into Auschwitz, and Mengele had injected cancer cells into his throat. And his brother ultimately died, but he escaped Auschwitz, was liberated in January 1945, and lived and went to live in Israel, and had children and grandchildren. And he spoke with a machine on his throat because when he got to Israel, the cancer had grown and they had to take his vocal cords out. But this man, Ephraim, lived, and he's got grandchildren, and he's very proud of that. But he told me about the things that Mengele had done to the twins there, and how nice he was with them, but how cruel he was at the end of their lives. Now, after that, these twins were never thought, it was never thought by Mengele that these twins would ever live anyway, but he wanted to use them for experimental purposes. So after their death, all of them went vigorous post-mortem examinations. Documentation of testing, experiments, and post-mortems were meticulously kept and sent to Würscher in Berlin. So the idea that Mengele was just killing people and that was the end of that is not true. He used people for testing and for this goal of creating this super Aryan race. Eyes, blood, and body tissues were also taken and sent to Berlin for storage and research. In all, 1,500 twins were experimented on by Mengele, and only 200 survived. And as Edwin Black puts it in this amazing book, he says, he puts it like this, he says, only the 200 had not yet been killed. If it had not been for liberation, they would have been killed. Now, Mengele would be nice to prisoners, but he would often turn into rages and beat them to death or shoot them. On the outside, he was very nice, but he was a vicious, vicious man. Thus, Mengele was called the Angel of Death. But there were many doctors in other camps who were conducting experiments on prisoners in a national effort to create the perfect Aryan master race. So you can see Würscher's got this big institute. Mengele is working for him, and so are many other doctors throughout the death camps. And we see that. I mentioned the Nuremberg children, didn't I, 3 or 4 weeks ago, who were taken away and tested with tuberculosis and eventually hung. So there was a lot of experimentation going on with the purpose of eugenics to create this super Aryan master race. So that was Mengele. He didn't stand alone. He can't be charged with just being a madman working on his own, killing twins and killing others. He has to be charged alongside many of these others in conspiracy with those to murder people simply for medical research or eugenics research, and also to generational hereditary issues so that they could create this Aryan race. Now, after liberation in January 1945, Mengele fled, giving the records of his experiments to a nurse who he was involved with. But he was captured in June 1945 by the Americans. He was released at the end of July 1945, despite having given his correct name. He returned to collect his papers from the nurse after that. Until the 17th of April 1949, from that time onwards, he worked under a false name as a farmhand in Germany and then fled to South America. And there he was supported by the Ratlines program. Now, I want to bring you another book. It's called An Unholy Trinity, written by Mark Ahrens and John Loftus. A really interesting book, which talks about how the Vatican helped criminals, war criminals, murderers in Holocaust to escape to many places, but including South America. And this is a really good book. Now, this book talks about the Ratlines program. In Argentina, he founded, this is Mengele now, founded a carpentry business, and in 1956 obtained a copy of his German birth certificate, and which was in his real name, and that enabled him to be granted a residence permit, which allowed him ultimately to obtain a West German passport. And from that time on, he actually visited Austria and Germany and traveled into Europe quite freely because he had a correct passport. Now, on the 30th of June 1959, Mengele fled to Paraguay because people like Simon Wiesenthal, who was a Nazi hunter, a survivor of Holocaust, tried to have him deported to Israel, but the Argentinians didn't want to do that, and but Mengele fled to Paraguay because things were getting pretty hot for him in Argentina. Now, on the 7th of February 1979, after living for 20 years in Paraguay, but also crossing back into Argentina and traveling to Europe occasionally, he drowned in a swimming pool while having a stroke. So Wiesenthal couldn't get hold of him, and he wasn't brought to justice. Now, in 1992, it was discovered that during that time, Mengele had continued with some of his medical research in Argentina and Paraguay, and actually had performed abortions there. And I want to look into that a little bit more at another time, but he continued with his evil ways as well, even in South America. Now, Mengele died, but what happened to Verscher? Because Verscher was Mengele's boss, he was his mentor. So after the war, Verscher became a respected German eugenics scientist. And in 1949, he became a member of the American Society of Human Genetics. He later became a member of the Austrian, Italian, and Japanese eugenics programs. Verscher was never held responsible for his war crimes, and the findings and investigations into his life with relationship to Mengele at Auschwitz and eugenics and the related murders were actually covered up for 15 years. So investigations proved he was involved, but the reports were buried for 15 years. He was never brought to justice and was killed in a car accident in 1969. Other German eugenics scientists, however, with a history of eugenics and atrocities during the war, was secretly allowed access to America under what became known as Operation Paperclip. Now, these scientists who had a record of murder and cruelty in Germany during the Holocaust against Jews and against people who were poorly, like Verscher and Mengele, never faced justice, and they were brought to America under this Operation Paperclip, so that they could help with NASA scientists in creating rockets and other military equipment, and also some of them helped with the eugenics program in America. They never faced justice. Now, there are books on Operation Paperclip, and Robinson, a historian, has written a book called Operation Paperclip, but there are other books. You can access those on Amazon. It's a very interesting subject. I don't want to go down that line because it takes me off course with Holocaust, but I hope I've given you some idea about Mengele and Verscher and the eugenics program in Auschwitz that was not only a part of the German Nazi eugenics program to eliminate every Jew from Europe, but was also linked into the American eugenics program, which continued until 1976. And I hope I've brought some information to bear here. And also, I think for me, one of the most important things is the understanding that IBM had created a data collection machine which helped Nazi Germany identify their victims. And I think this understanding that we have now, that it wasn't just a mass roundup and mass murders and nobody knew who was the victims, has been rectified. I hope that understanding has been brought into the light, really, that it was actually a specific targeting of the Jewish people. Now, thank you for staying with me tonight. I know there's a lot of information there, and it's not pleasant information to read, but we're going to, as I say, we'll have a break now until the 15th of July, and hopefully we'll have Shirley Segev being able to tell us about her family and Holocaust. And I'll let you know whether we're on Zoom or whether we are on YouTube. But if you're not part of our congregation, would you just send us an email so that I know who you are, and then I can send the details back to you, and I'll ask Becky, our church manager, to keep you well informed of how we're going on. But enjoy the next 2 or 3 weeks and have a break, and we'll see you on the 15th of July. So thank you very much. Bye, Tom.